Hello. My name is Michael Reed, and this is my tragic story. I am 50 years old, though most mornings my bones say otherwise. 5 years ago, I married a woman named Linda. A kind, careful woman, still haunted by the wreckage of her first marriage. She had 2 children, Joshua and Molly. When I met them, they were polite in that distant, rehearsed way children are when they've already decided not to trust another adult. Their father had disappeared long ago, leaving behind a house that carried his ghost like a disease. The unpaid debts, the cracked foundation, the silence. The place stood on the outskirts of Denver, a 2-story reminder that love doesn't survive neglect. The first time I walked in, the air was heavy with dampness, a slow rot that seeped into the paint and the furniture. The living room smelled of mildew and resignation. I remember the sound of water dripping from a cracked ceiling into a dented pot. The walls were yellowed, the baseboards warped, the windows sealed shut with layers of paint and time. It didn't feel like entering a home. It felt like stepping into someone else's regret. But I stayed. Maybe because I've always believed that if you put enough work into something broken, you could make it whole again. Maybe because Linda looked at me that night with a kind of quiet pleading, not for love, but for help. So I gave it. The first months were a blur of repairs. I replaced the roof shingles one by one, rewired the fuse box after an old short had burned half the kitchen outlets. I fixed the heating, mended a leaking pipe under the bathroom sink, scraped away mold until my knuckles bled. On weekends, I'd drive to hardware stores, fill the bed of my truck with materials, and come home to build what the old husband had left undone. There was pride in it at first, that stubborn pride men carry when they turn decay into function. I believed that every nail I drove into those walls was an act of love. That if I could restore the house, maybe the people inside it would learn to see me as more than a replacement. I was wrong. Joshua was 17, quiet, clever, and already halfway out the door to college. Molly was 15, curious, talented, and utterly indifferent to my presence. I tried to bridge the distance between us with gestures. I bought Joshua a used laptop for his classes, paid for Molly's art supplies, and surprised them both with an old minivan so they could drive themselves to school. I told myself small sacrifices would build something bigger. But in return, I got politeness. Nothing cruel, nothing overt. Just a wall of courtesy that kept me on the outside. At dinner, Joshua would answer my questions with one-word replies, eyes fixed on his phone. Molly would smile faintly and then look away. Their mother would try to keep conversation alive, asking about my work, her voice trembling slightly when the silence grew too thick. Still, I stayed patient. I told myself families like this just needed time to adjust. That love wasn't immediate. It was something that grew in the cracks you filled together. So I kept filling them. When Linda cried at night over the mountain of debt her ex-husband had left behind, I told her not to worry. I paid the overdue mortgage. I cleared the credit cards. I refinanced what I couldn't erase. The weight of it didn't bother me then. I thought I was buying peace, not obligation. There's a special kind of blindness that comes with hope. You start mistaking your own effort for progress. At family gatherings, Linda's relatives would joke about how lucky I was. A ready-made family, they'd say, raising glasses, their laughter hollow. I smiled along. Inside, I felt the quiet humiliation of a man applauded for inheriting someone else's unfinished mess. They didn't see the long nights, the double shifts, the quiet exhaustion of trying to prove myself to people who'd already chosen their loyalties. Joshua and Molly always introduced me as Mom's husband. Not stepdad, not even Michael. Just Mom's husband, a title that sounded temporary, like something rented rather than lived in. And Linda, she rarely corrected them. Maybe she thought it wasn't worth the argument. Maybe silence felt safer. But her silence cut deeper than their words. Little by little, I began to fade into the background. Every morning, I'd wake before sunrise, make coffee, and sit in the kitchen listening to the pipes groan. I'd glance at the family photos on the wall, all taken before me, and wonder if I'd ever earn a place among them. Then I'd go to work, 12-hour shifts at the plant, my hands cracked from the cold. I'd come home, fix what needed fixing, pay what needed paying. The rhythm became my whole existence. The house stopped being a home. It became a project I was financing. There were moments, brief, flickering, when I thought I saw progress. When Molly left one of her paintings on the counter, unsigned but placed where I'd find it. When Joshua once asked for help changing a tire. When Linda rested her head on my shoulder and said, "I don't know what we'd do without you." I held on to those moments like proof. Proof that my presence mattered. Proof that patience would someday be repaid with belonging. But the truth lingered beneath it all, unspoken. This wasn't my family. It was a structure built on dependence, not connection. A house that needed me more than it wanted me. And deep down, I began to sense the cracks. Not in the walls, but in the air itself. The way Joshua's tone hardened when I spoke. The way Molly's laughter stopped when I entered the room. The way Linda looked away whenever one of them compared me to their father. Their father. The ghost whose name still hung in every corner. He was gone but never absent. His photos still lined the hallway. His old jacket still hung in the closet. His stories, half lies, half memories, still lived in their voices. I didn't compete with a man. I competed with a myth. And myths don't decay the way people do. By the end of that first year, I had rebuilt almost everything the eye could see. The roof, the wiring, the furniture, even the garden out back. But no matter how much I restored, the feeling of exclusion only deepened. At night, when the house went quiet, I would lie awake and listen to the creak of the old floorboards, wondering if they resented the new nails I'd forced into them. Maybe I wasn't rebuilding a home. Maybe I was trespassing in someone else's memory. I remember one particular evening. A storm rolling through, the power flickering. I stood in the living room holding a flashlight while Joshua and Molly sat on the couch, scrolling their phones even as the wind howled outside. "Generators ready," I said. No one looked up. In that moment, I realized I had become a piece of furniture, useful, replaceable, mute. The man who kept the lights on. Necessary but never loved. And though I didn't know it then, that was the beginning of the end. The slow, invisible unraveling of everything I thought I was saving. The days began to blend into each other. Long corridors of repetition and silence. I would wake before dawn, shave under flickering light, and leave for work before anyone else stirred. By the time I returned, the house was full of voices that did not need mine. The dinner table became a polite stage where I was the extra. Present, silent, necessary for the scene, but not part of the dialogue. Joshua was in college by then, coming home on weekends with new opinions and the kind of arrogance that passes for maturity. He talked about politics, professors, the city, always in a tone that implied the rest of us were stuck somewhere beneath him. When I asked questions, he'd answer without looking up, his words thin and perfunctory. Molly, quieter but sharper, had inherited her mother's habit of withholding. She didn't argue. She dismissed. A look, a sigh, the faint roll of her eyes whenever I tried to offer advice. And Linda, she became fluent in silence. At first, I mistook it for peace. Now I understand it was surrender. I spent my evenings fixing things that no one asked me to fix. The garage door, the washing machine, the cracked frame of a window that had been ignored for years. My tools became my only company. The rhythm of hammer and wrench filled the space where conversation used to live. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the dark window, I barely recognized the man staring back. Someone halfway between exhaustion and habit. I was a ghost living among the living. I remember one evening, early spring. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. The roof leaked again. Not from my repairs, but from the rot beneath them. I climbed up anyway, drenched to the bone, patching what I could with tar and tape. From the yard below, I could see them through the kitchen window. Linda making tea, Molly scrolling her phone, Joshua sitting at the table with that distracted half-smile that didn't include me. They didn't look up. Not once. I finished the patch, climbed down, wiped the mud from my hands, and realized no one had even noticed I'd gone outside. I might have fallen from the roof and they would have kept talking. That night, when I entered the kitchen, Linda said, "Oh, you're wet." I wanted to laugh. Wet was the least of it. But all I said was, "The leak's fixed." She nodded and poured herself another cup of tea. That was our marriage. A long series of fixed leaks no one thanked me for. At work, my colleagues asked about my family. I smiled and said they were fine. What else could I say? That I lived in a house where I was both provider and stranger? That every gesture of care was met with indifference so practiced it almost felt deliberate? There's a cruelty in being needed but not wanted. It doesn't scream. It erodes. Slowly, invisibly, like rust beneath paint. At family gatherings, Linda's relatives still joked about how lucky I was. A ready-made family, no diapers, no sleepless nights, no chaos. They said it as if parenthood were something you could skip to the easy part of. I smiled, nodded, pretended the joke didn't sting. Inside, I felt that old ache, the one that comes when your efforts are mistaken for convenience. Once, at Thanksgiving, one of Linda's cousins raised a glass to me. "To Michael," he said, "the man who walked into a storm and came out with a family." Everyone laughed. Joshua muttered, just loud enough for Molly to hear, "More like a landlord." She giggled. I heard it. Linda heard it. But she didn't say a word. Her silence, that was what finally began to break me. It wasn't the children's contempt. Children test boundaries. They push. But when the person beside you refuses to draw the line, you start to vanish. I realized that in our home, I had become a system, not a man. Bills paid themselves through me. Cars refueled through me. Repairs, tuition, groceries. All invisible labor flowing through the same quiet conduit. Me. Yet my presence registered only when something failed. If the power went out, they called for me. If the Wi-Fi broke, they shouted my name. If the fridge was empty, I heard it in their sighs. But when things worked, when the lights stayed on, the fridge full, the car fueled, I was forgotten. That's how invisibility works. It's not absence. It's reliability mistaken for air. One evening, after dinner, I tried to talk to Linda. The kids were upstairs. The house hummed with the quiet I had built. "Do you ever feel," I asked, "like I don't belong here?" She didn't look up from her plate. "Why would you say that?" "Because it's true." She sighed, the kind of sigh that ends conversations before they start. "They're just young. They'll come around." "They're adults," I said. "Old enough to drive, vote, insult me." She flinched, then tried to soften her tone. "They don't mean it." "Then why does it feel so deliberate?" She didn't answer. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was crowded with all the things we'd stopped saying, all the resentment piled up like unwashed dishes between us. Later that night, I stood in the hallway staring at the framed photos lining the wall. Almost all of them were from before me. Birthdays, school plays, family trips. A life I hadn't lived but was still paying for. My reflection stared back between their smiling faces like an afterthought. That was when I realized something simple, devastating, and final. You can't join a story that was written without you. The next morning, I woke before everyone else. The sky outside was a dull gray, the kind that promises nothing. I brewed coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the house breathing, pipes creaking, with settling footsteps above me. I thought about how easily life can turn into maintenance. How love, without acknowledgement, becomes another utility bill, necessary but unnoticed. Molly came down first, yawning, earbuds in. She poured cereal without a glance in my direction. "Morning," I said. She mumbled something that could have been a greeting or could have been nothing. A few minutes later, Joshua appeared, already dressed, smelling of cologne. "Need gas money?" I asked, out of habit more than kindness. He hesitated, then said, "Sure." I handed him a 20. He took it without meeting my eyes. When he left, I sat staring at the empty space he'd left behind. That was my role, to fill the spaces others walked through. Sometimes, on the drive to work, I'd pass by other houses. Families eating breakfast, laughter spilling out of open windows. I'd wonder if their stepfathers felt the same dull ache, the same quiet humiliation of being useful but unseen. I think that's when bitterness began to take root. Not hatred, I never hated them, but resentment has its own slow rhythm. like water carving through stone. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps going until one day the foundation gives way. That foundation cracked the night I overheard Molly on the phone. She was in the living room, whispering, unaware I was standing by the doorway. "I know," she said, laughing. "He tries too hard. Mom says he means well, but it's kind of pathetic." Then silence. A pause. "No, he's not my real dad. He just pays for everything." The words hit me harder than any argument ever could. They were said casually, carelessly, which made them honest. I stood there for a moment, listening to her voice dissolve into more laughter, and I realized the truth. I wasn't invisible because they ignored me. I was invisible because they only saw what I provided. That night I didn't sleep. I walked the house like a stranger, touching the walls I'd rebuilt, the doors I'd hung, the rooms I'd furnished. Every nail, every dollar, every ounce of effort, all of it had gone into a place that had never once called me its own. By dawn, I made a quiet promise to myself. I wouldn't beg to be seen anymore. The next part of the story begins with what happens when that promise is kept. It happened on an ordinary evening. The kind of night that arrives quietly, without warning, without tragedy. At least not the kind you can see. Dinner was late. Linda had made pasta, the same meal she always turned to when she was too tired to pretend the day had gone well. The rain outside tapped against the windows, soft but constant. Joshua was home from college, buried in his phone. Molly was sketching in her notebook, her earbuds trailing like roots across the table. I tried to speak. I mentioned the bills, the car insurance renewal, the tuition payments stacking up faster than I could manage them. "We might need to cut back a little this year," I said, keeping my tone gentle. "Just until things even out." Joshua laughed, that short, sharp sound young men make when they want a wound without effort. "You don't get to decide that," he said. "You're not Dad." The fork slipped from my hand. For a second, even the rain stopped. Linda froze. Molly didn't look up. Joshua kept scrolling, as if he hadn't just dismantled 5 years of my patience with one sentence. When I didn't answer, he smirked. "What?" "I'm just saying." "You're not." Molly added, softly but clearly. "He's right." That was all it took. Not shouting, not anger, just confirmation. I looked at Linda, waiting for her to speak. She didn't. She just stared at her plate, her silence loud enough to finish the job. I'd always thought betrayal came like thunder, loud, sudden, violent. But it doesn't. It comes quietly, through the mouths of children who learned from the adults when to keep still. I said nothing. The rest of dinner passed in silence. The kind that fills a room until even breathing feels disrespectful. That night, while Linda watched television in bed, I sat at the kitchen table. The glow from the hallway light fell across the unpaid bills, the grocery receipts, the lists of expenses that spelled my worth in numbers. I realized I had built this entire life on a lie, that devotion could replace blood, that effort could rewrite history. Can't. You can pour yourself into someone else's family, but the cracks stay where they are. They only widen. I opened my laptop. The cursor blinked like a metronome. I began listing everything tied to my name, the car, the insurance, the utilities, the college funds, the subscriptions. Line after line, every necessity in that house flowed through me. It was grotesque, the sheer volume of what I'd been holding up. I stared at the total. The number didn't even feel real. And then the decision came, not in anger but in clarity, the kind that feels like taking a deep breath after years underwater. I would stop, not yell, not threaten, just stop. If they believed I didn't belong, then I would teach them what my absence really cost. The next morning, before anyone woke, I began the quiet dismantling. I canceled the automatic payments. I removed my name from their car insurance. I froze the credit cards, the ones they used without asking. I called the service companies and transferred everything into Linda's name. My voice was calm, steady, professional. It felt less like revenge and more like an audit of my own mistakes. When Linda came downstairs, she found me still sitting at the table, coffee steaming beside the laptop. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She smiled weakly. "Neither could I." I nodded, but I didn't explain why. By afternoon, the silence between us had changed. It wasn't tired anymore. It was final. That evening, Joshua came into the kitchen holding his phone. "My gas card's declined," he said. "Can you check the account?" I sipped my coffee. "It's canceled." He blinked. "What? Why?" "Because I'm not your dad," I said softly. "Remember?" His expression twisted. "You're being childish." "Maybe," I said, "but I learned from the best." He left muttering curses. I felt nothing. A few hours later, Molly appeared at the doorway. "Netflix isn't working," she said, her voice sharp, impatient. "I know," I said. "You gonna fix it?" "No," she frowned. "Why not?" "Because I'm done fixing things." Her eyes flashed. "This is ridiculous." "So was pretending I belonged here." She stormed off. Upstairs, I could hear their voices. Shock first, then anger, then confusion. That confusion comforted me. It meant they were finally noticing my existence, even if only through its withdrawal. By nightfall, Linda confronted me. Her face was pale, her voice trembling with that familiar mixture of fear and guilt. "What's going on?" she demanded. "I stopped paying for everything that doesn't belong to me." "You can't just, Michael, this isn't fair to the kids." "They're not kids," I said. "They're old enough to know what they said. Old enough to mean it." "They were upset." "No," I said. "They were honest. I just decided to believe them." She stepped closer, tears filling her eyes. "Please, don't do this. You're angry." "I'm awake," I interrupted. "That's all." For years, I had been the quiet provider, the invisible man funding everyone else's comfort. Now I was cutting off the illusion. She tried to reason with me, but her words fell apart. When she realized I wouldn't argue, she went silent again. That was her way of avoiding responsibility. Hide behind stillness until the storm passes. But this storm wasn't passing. It was leaving. That night I packed a small bag. Not much: clothes, tools, a few photos of my own parents. I left the rest. On the kitchen counter, I placed a folded note. Simple words. "It's your turn now. Learn what it costs." At dawn, I loaded the bag into the truck. The street was quiet. The house behind me stood still, almost peaceful. I looked up at the window where Linda slept, at the roof I'd repaired, the porch I'd rebuilt, the home I'd paid for with years of invisible devotion. None of it looked like mine anymore. As the engine started, I felt something strange. Not regret, not pride. Relief. The kind of relief that comes when pain finally runs out of room inside you. The train station was almost empty when I arrived. I bought a ticket to Santa Fe, no return. While I waited, I watched the early sun climb over the tracks, painting everything gold. I thought about the years I had given them, the endless work, the small humiliations, the quiet endurance. I wondered if they would ever understand the difference between love and dependence. Probably not. But I didn't need their understanding anymore. When the train arrived, I boarded without looking back. Through the window, the house of my failures grew smaller until it disappeared completely. For the first time in years, the air felt clean. The life I'd built had collapsed, yes, but under its ruins, something unexpected stirred, the faint pulse of freedom. And as the city of Denver shrank into distance, I realized that leaving isn't always an act of loss. Sometimes it's the only honest thing a man can do. Santa Fe felt like a different planet. The air was dry, thin, and honest in a way Denver never was. I rented a single room above a small carpenter's shop on Canyon Road. The man who owned it, Alvarez, didn't ask questions. He handed me a key, pointed to a narrow staircase, and said, "You fix what's broken, you keep it cheap." That was enough of a deal for me. The room had a bed, a desk, and a window that looked out over a street where strangers passed without knowing my name. For the first time in years, I wasn't needed. The absence of responsibility was so sharp it almost hurt. The first nights were the hardest. My body still woke at 5, expecting the sound of footsteps, the clatter of dishes, the subtle tension of a house that never slept in peace. Instead, there was silence. Not the punishing kind I'd known before, but the kind that asks you who you are when no one else is watching. I started working at the shop full-time, repairing old furniture, shaping wood that had already lived several lives. There was something sacred in that repetition. Sanding, fitting, joining. As if every splinter I smoothed carried a confession of its own. The owner liked my discipline. "You work like a man paying a debt," he said one afternoon. He wasn't wrong. Weeks passed before Linda reached out. The first message came as a text. "You left us in chaos. The kids are terrified. We can't pay everything." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I put the phone away. A few days later came another, "Please, just talk to me." I didn't reply. Silence had become my language. But silence has a way of turning into a mirror. Every night, I caught my reflection in that small window. A man stripped of purpose, halfway between guilt and clarity. I told myself I'd done the right thing. Still, the absence of their noise haunted me. Even contempt is a kind of contact. Then the letters started. The first was from Joshua. He wrote in neat, careful handwriting, the kind he used for essays. "I get it now, Mike. You were the one who kept things running. I didn't see it until it all stopped. I wish I'd said thank you." I read it twice, folded it neatly, and set it on the desk. Gratitude that arrives after bankruptcy is just an apology with interest. A week later, another letter, this one from Molly. Her handwriting was shaky, ink smudged in places. "I hate that you're gone. The roof leaks again. Mom cries a lot. I know we were awful. I wish I could take it back." I didn't answer that one either. Not out of cruelty, but because some lessons must live in silence to stay true. Linda's messages changed tone over time. First anger, "You're punishing us for being human." Then pleading, "Come home, please. The kids miss you." And finally confession, "I should have defended you. I see that now." I never blocked her. I just let the messages gather like leaves against the door. Sometimes I'd read them before bed, not to feel regret, but to remember why I left. The shop became my refuge. By day, I built tables for strangers. By night, I walked the quiet streets, learning to live without the weight of being needed. Alvarez sometimes joined me for coffee after closing. He had 4 grown children who still called him every week. When he asked if I had any, I told him, sort of. He nodded like a man who knew the shape of that word. Months slipped by. The letters came less often. The silence between us solidified into something permanent. Not peace, not hatred, just the absence of motion. Then one afternoon, a package arrived at the shop. Inside was a photograph. The 3 of them standing in front of the house. My old house. The paint had peeled, the lawn was patchy, but they were smiling in that fragile way people do when they're pretending to rebuild. No note, just the image. I studied it for a long time. The distance between them looked wider than before. Maybe that was the price of truth. Once you expose dependency for what it is, it never heals the same. I didn't frame the photo. I burned it in the small metal bin behind the shop. Watched the faces curl and blacken, the smoke rising into the clean desert air. After that, I moved again farther west to the Oregon coast. The workshop there was small but busy, a place where broken furniture and broken people seemed to share the same story. Teenagers came in on weekends to learn the trade. Kids who'd grown up with nothing solid to hold. I taught them how to plane a board straight, how to sand along the grain. It wasn't redemption, just work. Honest, quiet work. Sometimes I told them small things about my life. Not the whole truth, just the pieces that still mattered. That respect is rarer than love. That gratitude means little without consistency. That silence can be mercy or punishment, depending on who you give it to. They listened. Maybe they even understood. Occasionally, news from Denver reached me through mutual acquaintances. Joshua graduated. Molly found a job at an art supply store. Linda moved in with her sister for a while, then back into the house I'd saved from foreclosure. Life continued, proof that nobody dies from absence, they just adapt to it. I didn't feel bitterness, only a distant curiosity, like reading about people you once knew but no longer belong to. Sometimes, on rainy nights, I'd stand by the ocean and watch the waves erase the shore, over and over. Each collapse sounded like a breath leaving a body. That's what freedom felt like. Not joy, not triumph, but release. One evening, as I locked up the workshop, I found a letter slipped under the door. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope you're okay. The house is quieter now. Sometimes, when it rains, I think of you on the roof. Linda. I read it twice, folded it carefully, and put it in my pocket. For the first time in years, I felt no anger toward her, only an understanding that love and guilt often wear the same face. I didn't reply. Some stories end better in silence. Now, years later, the ocean is my only witness. I wake with the tide, work with my hands, eat simple meals. The quiet no longer feels empty. It feels earned. Sometimes I dream of that house. The flicker of the hallway light, the sound of rain on patched shingles, the faint laughter of children who never learned how to say thank you. But when I wake, all I hear is the sea. And in that endless, steady sound, I finally understand. Love without respect isn't love at all. The servitude disguised as devotion. I gave them everything I had, time, labor, belief, and in return, they gave me the truth I needed to live. Was I wrong to leave? Maybe. But tell me, would you have stayed?